Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Common Ground, Regional Collaborative Approaches to Soil Health, a terrific workshop. We have 4 strong presenters to share some great insights about soil health in today's workshop. It'll be about a 75-minute workshop. And before we get too far into it, let me do the housekeeping for the session. So if Amanda, if you advance to the next slide, we'll share the housekeeping rules with the group. So the housekeeping include, obviously, as you all know, if you've been attended other sessions, the session will be recorded and will be shared. So an opportunity to check back in later. Attendees are muted by the host. If you'd like to update your name with your pronoun and organization, please do so. You do that by hovering over your image and then changing your name and by selecting rename. If you are having technical issues, please message the host in the chat box. We have a host attending the chat box who can help tackle any technical issues that may arise. Questions and answers will be taken throughout the workshop. So each of our speakers will take questions following their presentation. So feel free to populate the chat box with questions. You can include your questions in the Whova Q&A box. You can also put them in the Zoom chat box. So we'll be monitoring those questions throughout and hope to get to questions that you have. All right, let me introduce our presenters for today. We've got, again, like I said, a real strong team representing 4 states across the Chesapeake Bay region. Amanda Cather, Project Director, the Million Acre Challenge. And we have Lisa Blazure, Soil Health Coordinator, and she's with Stroud Water Research Center out of Pennsylvania. Mary Sketch Bryant, Coordinator of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. And we have Kevin Antoszewski, Healthy Soils Program Coordinator with the Maryland Department of Agriculture. So we've got these, again, a great slate of presenters. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Sketch to start to get us underway.
Great, thank you, Liz, and so glad to see you all virtually. We'll go ahead and kick us off here because I know we have a short amount of time. So to start, here we are at a watershed forum, and why are we talking about soil health? Why should we all as conservation professionals care about soil health, especially in the context of the watershed more broadly? And Amanda, I'll let you see if you can hit the next, see if that pops up. There we go. And we'll have you hit one more too. So regenerating our soils and building healthy soil ecosystems has broad on and off-farm benefits, as you can see here. Enhanced productivity on the farm, increased water holding capacity, resilience across the board, as well as reduced erosion, suppressed diseases. But then really you're seeing those off-farm benefits too, from reducing greenhouse gases, increased carbon sequestration and habitat, and those cascading effects. And over the past century, soil managed for agriculture has lost as much as 60% of its original carbon content, which, that organic content can kind of be a proxy for soil health. And every year, the US loses approximately 996 million metric tons of soil due to erosion, and over 4 billion pounds of nutrients lost in the environment because of degraded soils. So really, keeping soil health at the center of a lot of what we do is critical. Next slide. So now that we've talked about why soil health is important for all of us as environmental professionals, what's it about and how do you get there and work towards that? So soil health and science can be really complex, but doesn't necessarily have to be. And so we like to, at the Virginia Soil Health Coalition and many of our partners, really start with this foundation of the 4 principles of soil health. You'll sometimes see 6 principles, and so I'll go into those other 2 as well, but those final 2 we see as overarching really all of soil health and these 4 principles. So number 1, keep the soil covered. This is your soil armor, keeping cover in the forms of cover crops and whatnot, and it's key for preventing erosion, compaction of soil, and suppresses weed growth and can provide really key habitat as well. And I'll have you click, Amanda. And minimize disturbance is number 2. Soil disturbance can take multiple forms, from physical through tillage, chemical such as nutrient and pesticide application, biological such as overgrazing. And this disturbance can lead to erosion, crusting, depleting organic matter, have multiple impacts on the soil. And then number 3 is maximize living roots. And this ties closely to keeping the soil covered. And you'll see there's so many intersections between all of this. And so it's the benefits of cover crops and really keeping those roots in the soil. And then number 4 is energize with diversity. And you want to get as much diversity in the landscape as possible. Where the soil is getting those carbon exudates from plant species, and can use diverse crop rotations, and it benefits the soil food web, helps with nutrient cycling, reduces diseases and pests. And I know I mentioned 5 and 6, and those 2 are integrating livestock and also knowing your context. And so, I think integrating livestock is really key to all 4 of these principles, as well as understanding the context of the land you're operating on and the nuances of that place, which we'll go into a little bit later. Next slide. So you have the 4 principles, but as you think about managing for healthy soils, you really have to keep these overarching priorities in mind, performance targets that really can help you refine what you're doing on the landscape. And so it kind of takes those 4 principles to the next level. And so 1 is eliminate erosion. And erosion has a disproportionate impact on soil organic matter as it removes that rich topsoil first, as well as matching land use to landscape. So we talked about that 6th principle of knowing your context. You can't have really a one-size-fits-all solution. And so considering these landscape factors, such as the water holding capacity of the ground, really the past management, what has been done on the ground and how has that led to the soil as it is right now. 3 is enhancing the soil biology. When we think about soil health and, you're really wanting to increase that quantity and diversity of biological activity. And then building soil organic matter and carbon. A lot of what we're concerned about with soil health is that total soil organic matter or soil carbon. It's kind of like that bank account. You want to be putting more into the soil than you're taking out of it through erosion and whatnot. And then 5, systems, not shortcuts. Also kind of ties into number 2 is, soil is an ecosystem, and we can talk about specific practices that we're doing on the land, such as not tilling or putting cover crops on, but really you're having to keep that whole system in mind and how it's all playing together, and also thinking about context there. Okay, next slide. So all of that said, this is a great little chart on kind of, some of the practices that tend to promote soil health or reduce it, such as no-till or reduced tillage, cover crops, perennial crops, diversifying rotations, a lot of things I've already mentioned here, and then what tends to reduce soil health. And, again, as this kind of points to, it isn't black and white. And while these practices do tend to promote or reduce soil health, it's really keeping the system in context of the landscape in mind as well. So I want to stop there for just a second and, see if there's any. I haven't really been keeping too close an eye on the chat, but any questions? I think we may have another minute or so before we have to move on, but let me know, Amanda, Lisa, or anyone, if how we're looking.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. That was really terrific overview. This is Liz. I do not see any questions in our chat. If there's an opportunity to take attendees off mute and share your questions or raise your hand, you can use the raise hand feature if you have questions. We would certainly invite an opportunity to ask Mary some questions relative to the concepts and principles she presented here. Without seeing any, why don't we move ahead to our next presentation? And there certainly are opportunities to ask questions of Mary as we progress, and especially at the end of the session. So we'll move to Amanda. Amanda, ready to roll there, Amanda?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Thanks so much. My name is Amanda Cather. I'm a pastured livestock farmer in Montgomery County, Maryland, and the project director for the Million Acre Challenge. And we are a collaborative effort to help farmers build healthy soils on their farms across the state. So Mary talked about the principles of soil health, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how those principles play out on the farm, starting with how we measure whether soil is healthy. And in order to think about how we do that, the first thing we need to think about is, why are we measuring on-farm soil health? So measuring soil health for farmers in a way that connects the principles that Mary talked about with the management practices that farmers have in place, can help farmers set goals, make decisions, and begin to work with what they have and assess their progress. So as Mary said, healthy soils have a range of benefits for farmers that includes environmental ones like water quality, improved carbon cycling, and increased biodiversity. Financial ones, increased overall enhanced profitability as input costs fall, production impacts like reduced incidence of diseases and pests, and yield stability, and resilience in the face of extreme weather events, and even sometimes an uptick in quality of life as their risk is reduced and farming seems fun again. So because soil health has that complement of environmental benefits with benefits for the farmers and their farms in the form of reduced risk and reduced inputs and stable yields, it's a win-win. And so in that way, it can really be a framework for a new holistic farmer-driven conservation management program. And I think Lisa and Kevin will talk about that a little bit later. At the Million Acre Challenge, we also see healthy soils as the foundation of regenerative agriculture, which we see as farming in a way that rebuilds rather than merely sustains healthy farm ecosystems and healthy farm communities. So in short, why do we make measurements of soil health? We measure soil health to help farmers make decisions about management in order to make a living on the land while improving it at the same time. So that being said, now that we know the why, we can think a little bit about the how. So some of us, we think of soil health as being a new concept, but measurements of healthy soils aren't new. Farmers have known intuitively for generations and probably thousands of years if their soils are healthy by the way the soil looks and smells and feels in their hands and under their feet, and by the way it behaves in good weather and bad. So the tests that we do with farmers need to be relevant to what we are observing on our fields. So we have a number of ways that we can assess soil health. We can use indicators or measurements as tools to represent some of what farmers know already instinctively. When we measure soil health, we're looking at the chemistry of the soil, so macro and micronutrients. Those can be very familiar to those of us who care about water quality, like nitrogen and phosphorus. The physical condition of the soil, including compaction and infiltration, and the biological functioning of the soil. So the macro and microorganisms that are doing so much of those ecosystem jobs for us in the soil, how are they faring? And we can look at those three different aspects of the soil. Some of this we can look at in the field with assessments like the NRCS Soil Health Card. And I think Kevin will talk about the Maryland version of this a little bit later in our presentation. Farmers can also look at some of these indicators themselves using the SLAKES test, which is an app that can help farmers assess aggregate stability, the way the soil holds together in their fields. They can also do things like earthworm counts to look at one measure of biodiversity in their fields. We can also use lab tests, which can add indicators like organic matter and active carbon to the list. And some of those, like the Cornell Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health, which we use in our Million Acre Challenge Soil Health Benchmark Study, they can provide farmers with a scorecard that can show constraints and suggest areas of improvement to help inform their management decisions. Ideally, some of the indicators that we look at are responsive to farmers' management in the medium to long term. Some of these indicators take a long time to start to move, but some of them we can see change in the medium to long term so that farmers can implement the soil health principles and start to see change on their farms. We can also look at models. Models are another way to assess soil health that I think Kevin will talk about again later on. And in addition to looking at indicators and models, we can also look at outcomes from healthy soils on the farm in a lot of different ways, including improved water dynamics, yield stability over time, because that means that farmers can count on a consistent bottom line yield as their soils become healthier, which is directly related to resilience. Because if you can weather a hard year with a reasonable bottom line, you can maintain consistent profitability. And with profitability, I think as farmers, we're all trained to think about productivity, but it's every bit as important to think about profitability, since the income that we make on our farm depends on how much our land produces, as well as our input costs and our labor. If we can maintain a stable yield with lower costs because we have healthier soils, we'll be more profitable over the long run. So all of that being said, do farmers care? Now that we've talked about why and how we measure soil health, It's important to really be aware that soil health is a long-term proposition. The practices that we put in place on our farm this year may not show up in our soil health test or our bottom line for several years. So it's easy for farmers like me to care very much about it and still have it fall to the bottom of the task list. So for those of us who work and collaborate with farmers, we always need to be thoughtful, show understanding and respect for the farmers we work with, and make our measurements of and conversations about soil health relevant to farmers. And Mary always says, because soil health is complex, it's often helpful for farmers to hear other farmers tell their own stories, because those stories make soil health concepts real. And so part of our soil health benchmark study at the Million Acre Challenge is exactly that, farmers meeting in peer networks to talk about their soil health test results and how their management practices are impacting them, using that common language to talk about conservation. This is a word cloud that the Million Acre Challenge Board of Soil Stewards created during one of their first meetings. And that's a group of farmers that really guides our project. And you can see that their priorities are really around profitability and resilience. So whatever assessments we at the Million Acre Challenge do that we want to communicate with farmers, whether that's on the farm, in a lab, or using a model, we try to connect them directly back to the profitability and resilience benefits that farmers care about, including the health and quality of life for farmers and their families. Again, for farmers, soil health isn't just a concept that makes us feel good. It's a day-to-day task list. And the way that that task list integrates with the 15 other task lists that we're trying to manage at any given day is going to make or break whether we're able to get it done. So that really needs to be the ultimate goal of any soil health measurement from the farmer's point of view, connecting those healthy soils indicators and those environmental benefits to profitable, resilient farm management with on-the-farm outcomes. So how does it look? This is how it looks on our farm. We don't reduce healthy soils to one practice. We think about soil health management systems as groups of complementary or synergistic practices that look different on every farm, but always follow those general principles laid out in that Mary talked about. So on our farm, healthy soils look like healthy pastures that grow healthy animals. From the day they're born, our sheep are on pasture. We rotate them every 24 to 48 hours, maximizing living roots and armoring the soil. And we give our pastures 60 days rest before the sheep return, minimizing disturbance. We also use the no-till drill that we rent from our county, which helps us improve biodiversity in our pastures while minimizing the disturbance that would result from plowing. There's my daughter working on to unclog the no-till drill. We also use lots of record keeping and brain power. Sometimes the laptop comes right out into the field to help track our rotations or our breeding systems. This is a mindset for management as much as anything. But the result on the right is our beautiful fields that allow our sheep to graze late into the fall. We have a healthy flock. We've cut down on our use of medicines and antibiotics, so reducing our inputs and reducing disturbance. Our pastures hold moisture in dry years. They drain well in wet years, and we're transitioning to a healthier mix of pasture plants the more we graze them with attention to soil health. So that's how it looks on our farm. It's also really important to think about the ways that healthy soils can look different on all different kinds of farms. So on the top left in our picture, we see an urban farm in Baltimore. They're using compost and cover crops, reducing tillage, and integrate agroforestry practices. Oh, Heather asked, where is our farm? We are located in Montgomery County, Maryland. Plow and Stars is the name of our farm. So yeah, that urban farm, that is called Bliss Meadows in Baltimore. Down below them, you see an organic grass-fed dairy in Western Maryland. They have eliminated outside fertility. They use management-intensive rotational grazing and increased efficiency. They've built some of the best soil in the state with less work and improved profitability, even though they have lower yields than some of their neighbors. To the right, you can see a vegetable CSA, that's in Prince George's County, Maryland. Again, they use different practices, crop rotation, extensive cover cropping. They integrate livestock when they can, and they reduce inputs through IPM to minimize disturbance. And above that farm, you can see a very large scale row crop farm on the eastern shore of Maryland. And that farm uses even different practices. They use no-till, advanced multi-species cover cropping, crop rotation, and integrated pest management. So all of these farms are using very different practices, and their farms look different and feel different, but they're all promoting these 4 principles of soil health: minimize disturbance, energize with diversity, maximize a living root, and keep the soil covered. And the outcomes for each of these farms show those results. So I also have a video of Danny Boyer in Maryland, but I'm not sure how we're doing on time.
We're doing fine on time, Amanda. Would love to see the video.
Okay, I will go ahead and play it.
Thank you.
I can mute myself. Hold on.
And be sure to just do the optimization feature. Really compelling top remarks, Amanda. Thanks for sharing those.
The more that I've learned by doing and making mistakes and figuring it out, there's a lot more than just taking a soil test and putting down the primary nutrient. I have two herds. I have a spring calving herd, I have a fall calving herd also, so that I have cattle throughout the year of different sizes. And then I keep all of my calves and finish them all out. I know everything that's been done to them from before they're born, the genetic behind them, all the vaccines. I finish them and they go direct to the consumer from there. So depend on forage for most of their needs. You want a good mixture of grasses in your sward. You want it tall enough that the animals are able to get down and wrap their tongue around it and get them a good bite. If you keep it grazed down really close, like you see in a lot of conventional systems, they actually physically can't get enough forage to go in to meet their needs. So this has got a little bit of red clover, it's got some orchard grass in it, it's got some fescue, probably got a little bluegrass, and then some other native grasses, warm seasons or whatever. Keeping it in a vegetative state is very, very important. So how do you get this? Takes a little bit of planning and some work. And I'm fortunate, and I have some volunteers that show up every day on my farm, and all I have to do is give them a place to stay. And so they do most of the work, and I just go out and, reap the benefit. So my volunteers are bacteria and fungi and protozoa and nematodes and arthropods and all of the things that live in the soil. And so it's very, very important, to make sure that we're supplying all the needs of the soil, not just the NP and the K. We have to look at all of the things. And when we do, and we allow the bacteria and the fungi to actively multiply and live in the soil, then they bring all the nutrients that we need. A soil scientist friend of mine said the soil resource base has plenty of nutrients in it. They're not available to you because of the way the soils have been managed. Get the soil in a healthy situation, and then all the nutrients are available. So I decided, well, let some of these critters do the work and not have to put all the nutrients down out of a bag. And this is what can take place. And if you feed your animals or allow them to have access to this in this particular sward that I just got out of my hand, you're probably looking at 18 to 20% protein. You're probably looking at 72 to 74 energy TDN in this forage. That will meet all the classes of livestock that you have. It'll take care of the soil, then that'll take care of the forage, and then that'll take care of the cattle or whatever livestock that you're grazing on that. And then you have a healthier product. Actually, you're doing something good for the resource base, for water quality, for air quality, for aesthetics, and on and on and on. It all starts with the soil.
That is terrific, Amanda. Thanks for sharing that. I'm feeling optimism about our planet's future when I hear you all talk about soil health and the potential it has for on so many conservation fronts. So thanks for sharing that. Any questions? I don't see any in the chat box that have not already been answered. That one question regarding where Amanda's farm is located. And that's Poolsville, Maryland. Is that right? Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Any questions for Amanda before we move on? Again, I'm feeling uplifted from seeing the video and hearing. And now we get to hear from Lisa Blazure, who brings a wealth of knowledge and great perspective from Pennsylvania. A lot of potential in Pennsylvania for soil health improvements. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Lisa right now. Lisa's here from Stroud Water Research Center, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Amanda just did a great perspective on why soil health is important to the farmer. And this next little segment is going to be about why soil health is important to those conservation organizations as well. So Stroud Water Research Center, we've been around for more than 50 years, studying all things freshwater, primarily streams and rivers, water chemistry, the bugs, the fish, how those stream systems change and flow, and the hydrology. So it may seem a little strange connection as to why this Water Research Center is embracing these concepts of soil health. And really what it comes down to, if we want healthy stream systems, we need healthy watersheds that drain into those stream systems. And a large portion of our land use in Pennsylvania around our streams is agriculturally managed lands. So these concepts and principles that we've been talking about this morning about soil health and the ability to really regenerate these soils so they're back to a healthy functioning soil ecosystem really changes the way that water flows across those farms, the nutrient management on those farms, the soil organic matter, and the way that water moves across those farm landscapes and ultimately reaches those streams, then the rivers and the Chesapeake Bay. So that's why we've really embraced this concept, because these practices that we're talking about are relatively low-cost practices to implement. And we're seeing, as Amanda said, they're a win for the farmer, but they're also a win for our stream systems and other environmental benefits. So Amanda, if you could advance the next slide, please. So one of the key things that we see in these farm systems that have adopted these practices for a number of years is that difference between how much water is infiltrating onto those soils versus running off. So this is a case study from a farm in central Pennsylvania. It's a large dairy system. They've been continuous no-till for about 40 years. They've been planting cover crops for almost 20 years now, and just really actively managing for soil health. They've got a lot of that dairy manure, and that all goes back onto the fields, and there's just something magical that happens with soil health when you can connect that animal back to the land. Grazing is by far the best system, but even when you can get manure out onto those soil systems, it really primes those systems and that biological activity. So this farm, anecdotally, right, when it rains, they're seeing a lot less water that's running off their fields. When they do see some runoff, it's clear water, it's not muddy water. So they have worked with a couple different research projects over the years to really try to hone in and measure the amount of water that's infiltrating on these fields. So there's some different techniques that you can do this. The photos here, there's a single ring infiltrometer. It's a 6-inch ring, and then a little bit more of a science-based study is that second photo there called a double ring infiltrometer. And there's protocols that you follow by adding water to these rings, and you time the measurement on how long it takes that water to infiltrate. So this chart on the right side is the actual data that was collected on this farm. So if you look in the orange bar under December 2014, KSAT is the hydraulic saturation for that soil type, that Buchanan soil. So if you were to look this up in the web soil survey that USDA generates, they would predict, based on just the parent material and the sand, silt, clay content of that soil and where it is in the landscape, that soil should only be able to infiltrate 1.3 inches of water per hour. And you can see from the results of the test on this farm, that single ring infiltrometer, they averaged 4.7 inches per hour. And then the double ring infiltrometer averaged 8.3 inches an hour. So this just really goes to show how these management decisions that are being made on the farm really can influence that soil structure, create that good crumbly, good structure soil with lots of air space and water space for that water to percolate down through. So really what we're seeing with soil health is a shift in our perspective. For a lot of years, our conservation organizations have treated runoff as the problem, right? We've contoured farm, we've put in strips, we build diversion ditches to catch that water and divert it off the field. But soil health is giving us that shift in perspective. So what we're understanding is we don't really have a runoff problem, we have that infiltration problem. So what are the core practices that we can do on these farms to help improve that infiltration? Next slide, please, Amanda. So it's not rocket science, right? We have less runoff leaving our farm fields, and then we're going to have less downstream flooding as a result of that. So what we don't want are these images on the left-hand side of the screen. We don't want that water flowing across the landscape, because as it's flowing across, not only is it scouring out and causing soil erosion, and we're losing that very precious topsoil layer on our farm fields, but it's picking up phosphorus that's attached to that soil. There could have been some urea that was side dressed, in the summertime, that's laying on the surface and hasn't soaked in yet. And that could, those fertilizers could get flushed off the fields. So we want to keep those nutrients, keep those resources on the farm fields, and not having them entering our water systems and having our streams and rivers running muddy when we do get those heavy rain events. So by infiltrating the soil, we're keeping that rainwater, that precious rainwater, within that crop root zone, and building that farm resiliency as we're building this soil organic matter and that organic sponge that holds onto that water. Go ahead, Amanda. So cover crops are an intricate part of that. Mary mentioned that as one of the core principles about having that living root system year round and keeping that soil covered. So another benefit that cover crops do, and when they're planted at the end of the growing season, is they're able to absorb and capture those leftover nutrients that may be left at the end of the growing season. So this is some data from both the University of Maryland that collected data at Harborview Farm, and as well as some Penn State data. And you can see they're both measuring nitrate concentrations in the groundwater. So in that soil surface, soil nitrate levels. And you can see in both studies, the plots that had no cover crops established definitely had the most nitrate leaching getting down into our groundwater systems. And then the varying species and multiple species of mixes do a really great job of capturing those leftover nutrients, and especially that leftover nitrogen, keeping it within that root zone and holding on to that till the next growing season. Next slide, please. So this is a case study from that similar dairy farm that I showed the infiltration data from. And this is simply just a mass balance example of the nutrients that they put onto the fields, primarily in the fall form of manure, and how much nitrogen they expect to get from the value of that manure application. And then there's known withdrawal rates for those nutrients based on the crops that's being grown and then the yields and the harvests. So this is just a quick mass balance spreadsheet. And I want you to focus on those numbers down at the final nutrient balance calculation numbers down at the end. So according to, this balance, this field is short by 48 pounds of nitrogen. So in order to grow those predicted yields that this farm has been able to harvest, the Penn State recommendations are that farm needs another 48 units of nitrogen to achieve those yields. But how is that farm able to achieve those yields without that additional fertilizer inputs? And that's because they've built this biological system and they're tapping into that organic pool of nutrients that are mineralizing by those microbes within the system. Amanda, hit that, the next slide, please, or next advance button, right? So if this farm follow Penn State's recommendation, they should be applying 48 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Next, click, Amanda. So on 340 acres that are under this corn silage rillage management system, this farm should be applying another 16,000 pounds of nitrogen. And they're able to achieve these yields without that additional cost of nitrogen. And urea prices, fertilizer prices have really spiked right now. So at the going rate of urea nitrogen, this farm is saving about $12,000 just on these 340 acres by not needing to apply that additional fertilizer. So there's huge potential that we have in our systems as we build soil health for farmers to be able to cut back on their input cost and cut back on some of their expenses to operate the farm. Next slide. So the other advantage we get when we're allowed and able to infiltrate that water and not run it off is we get this groundwater recharge potential. And this is critical for several reasons. A lot of the rural parts, Pennsylvania has a lot of rural landscapes that aren't on public water systems. So those landowners have individual wells on their property. So groundwater is their primary source of water to run their household. So we want to be able to recharge that groundwater system and keep those water tables high, not only for domestic water use, but it's also really critically important to maintain those summer flows in our stream systems. Because anytime we're not getting rain and that runoff input into our stream systems, all of that water in a summertime stream system comes from that groundwater base flow. So the more water that we can get infiltrating into this landscape, recharging that groundwater, it's going to seep out into our stream systems in the summertime. It's going to be much cooler water. It's going to be cleaner water, and we're able to maintain those healthier stream systems through the summer months. Next slide, please. So the three Bay states that are represented here on this call have all recognized the tremendous potential for soil health for meeting these water quality goals. So each of the states have gone through this process called a watershed implementation plan. We're now on the third version of these watershed implementation plans. And each of these states, we've incorporated soil health practices as part of our phase 3 WIP. So in Pennsylvania, we have set some very specific goals for adoption of acreage that we would like to see both in conservation tillage and no-till acreage. And then also some very specific goals for 33 to 50% of our croplands we would like to see planted to cover crops. And then Amanda touched on how important that grazing system is and how that can quickly restore and regenerate those soils. So we put a grazing goal into our plan as well. So Virginia has also incorporated soil health into theirs. They have this line item about capitalizing co-benefits on the farm and really maximizing those BMPs, not just only for soil health, but recognizing the broader picture of that climate and coastal resiliency and the downstream flood mitigation and carbon sequestration, that atmospheric carbon sequestration in Virginia. And Virginia has also recognized in their nutrient management program of the opportunity and the ability to try to start incorporating some of these soil health practices and soil health outcomes that we're seeing into their nutrient management plans that are being developed for the farms. So then Maryland's program, Maryland has really taken it to the next step. And Maryland's General Assembly has actually established the Maryland Healthy Soils Program, which Kevin, who's up after me, is the coordinator for that program. And Maryland too has done a great job over the years. They've got a cover crop cost share program that actually financially compensates and incentivizes farmers in the state of Maryland to plant cover crops. It's been a very, very successful program in the state of Maryland to get a lot of those cover crop acreages on the ground. And then Maryland also has funding at this agricultural cost share program that supports up to 100% of the cost of several water quality and healthy soil practices. So that program even goes beyond soil health and can do some of these other structural and waterway and more construction related practices on the farm as well. So Maryland has really established a great program, has kind of set the precedence for us in the Bay watershed of what is possible, and really helps to incentivize farmers to adopt these practices so that society as a whole can benefit. And I think that's the next slide, and we're open for questions again, Liz, I believe.
Yeah, and I do not see any questions specifically about, Lisa, your presentation, but a question did come up that was answered in the chat box. There are some good resources being put in the chat box for folks. Abdullah asked, how would we use these concepts on a small scale for personal farming? And Amanda provided some input information in the chat box in response to that. Amanda, do you want to add anything else in response to that question before we move into Alex's presentation or Kevin's presentation?
No, I think also the graphic that Mary put in there from Virginia Master Gardeners is also amazing. So yeah, lots of great resources for how to do this work in your backyard or on a small scale, on any scale.
Yeah, that's what's amazing about soil health. These 4 principles work at every scale of agriculture. I practice this in my raised beds in my backyard garden as well. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate hearing the application in both kind of suburban, urban, as well as obviously the agricultural landscape where there is so much potential. Again, I'm feeling optimistic that it's the soil that will help restore our environment. So if there are no further, let's see, I do see a question in the chat, in the Whova chat box, which I actually don't see, unfortunately, but let's see. I'll read the question. Do the panelists think that our conservation community will eventually be able to rely on integrators, seed fertilizer companies, and future food markets to accelerate soil health practices? If not, what can practitioners do to get their attention? Any of our presenters have thoughts on that? We can also kick it until the end if you want to. Let's have Alex present.
Kevin.
I'm going to let folks speak for a minute before I move on.
Yeah, I think that's a great question that maybe is a little more time involved with some answer that we can all put some input in. So I think maybe tabling that question till the end when we have a little more time to dive into it would be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see another question about hydroponic growing and whether that will replace growing traditional crops or raising food in the soil. And I would say I really hope not. I think that personally, I mean, obviously I have a bias as a farmer, but I really treasure agriculture and the way that humans interact with the land through agriculture, I feel like is something that we can not only maintain, but also regenerate. And we have just a tremendous opportunity, I think, through the broad scale regenerative agriculture movement to make agriculture part of the solution in so many ways that I would hate to see us move away from soil-based farming completely.
And I'll just jump on that quick too, Amanda, is that, I think a conversation that we often have is that, agriculture can be part of that solution, and it's not just returning soils to a healthy level, it's regenerating them to that next level. And that's really what it takes farmers. And, I think we talk a lot too with you're seeing increasing land development, that keeping land in production and in regenerative production is key as well. Concrete is not great for erosion, and not so just the role of agriculture.
Yeah, and I would also say that hydroponic systems are kind of energy and water intensive, and I think with kind of the energy and water challenges that we're going to be dealing with in the near future, I think finding ways to try to improve those resource limitations rather than finding, in my opinion, that would be a way of farming that wouldn't really solve the energy and water issues that we're having, just because it requires a lot more of both of those.
Good,
I see
thank you.
one more in the chat for Lisa. For those naysayers or skeptical adopters in Pennsylvania, do you have any ways to help change their mind to adopt these practices?
Right, we're always going to have kind of those skeptics and the naysayers. And I think potentially one option maybe kind of circles back to that question that we were going to table to the end, but if we could develop the markets for these products, and if farmers see that incentive, that financial incentive to do it, some of the folks that are on the fence now, maybe seeing that financial incentive may motivate them to do some changes. And wouldn't it be great to have a future world where farmers are paid for the quality, the nutrient density and the protein levels and the quality of the foods that are being grown, and not just the bushel yields and getting paid by volume. So that's my pie in the sky kind of vision of where agriculture could go in the future. I think there's also a little bit of growing interest for sure and excitement about this carbon market. And what we're seeing come out of it right now with the way that the system is established, folks that are new to adopting those practices really seem to gain the most opportunities in those private sector carbon markets. So time's going to tell to see if that may be of a motivating factor for farms that are a little on the fence right now to try to adopt some of these practices. Again, if they can get that financial incentive to do it, maybe that would be a good transition motivator for them. So it's an excellent question.
Great, thank you for those questions. And why don't we go ahead and move into Kevin's presentation, and then we can revisit any other questions and that one question that we tabled. But Kevin, take it away.
Sure, thank you. So I guess one way to think about how all of these practices kind of tie together and kind of conceptualize them in a way is to think about them as ecosystem services. We aren't doing all these things to improve the soil just for the sake of improving the soil. And a lot of them, they can be either directly related to soil health or kind of indirectly related to soil health. So here we can see a list of a handful of them. There's obviously way more than this that, we could talk about. But, you have your direct benefits like carbon sequestration, because, increased biological activity in the soil and increased carbon inputs in the soil, those are directly, capturing and storing carbon from the atmosphere. Things like reduced downstream flooding, if you're improving the infiltration rates, that's a direct result of increasing soil health. But then you also have things like reduced fossil fuel usage, and that's more of an indirect benefit of doing these practices, because if you're not tilling, you have fewer passes over the field with a tractor. If you're using manure applications or other compost, other organic nutrient applications, you're not using synthetically produced nitrogen that you need to make in a facility that has associated emissions with it and the transport and all that kind of stuff. Reduced nutrient and pesticide inputs and loss to the environment. You're not only are you putting less on, but more is being taken up by things like cover crops or less is being run off because you have less runoff. You can go to the next slide. And the bulk of what I'm going to talk about is a handful of different tools that we can use to start thinking about soil health and some of these ecosystem services or co-benefits. The intent is not to have anybody be an expert in any of these, because they take a little while to learn and figure out how to use, but to kind of give an introduction and kind of a broad overview, so that if you're presented with a question, you might be able to say, oh, this tool could be helpful, and then kind of move into exploring how they work. And I think the links to them should be put into the chat kind of as we talk about them. And for some of them, it could be really helpful to pull them up and kind of explore the interface as I'm talking about it, especially for the more simple ones. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is Comet Planner. And this is it's a fairly straightforward kind of lookup table that will give you carbon sequestration values for different practices. So it gives you values in carbon equivalence. So if you don't know, carbon equivalence is, basically converting all the heating potential of gases to carbon so that we can talk about it really easily. And these CO2 values, they're based on data collection and the best currently available science. So this tool is kind of constantly being updated. I actually had to go and replace the screenshot this morning because I realized I was using an older version of the interface. And so they've kind of expanded it to be a little bit more detailed. I don't know if any of you have it open, but the way it works is you kind of pick out your state and your county, and then you pick different practices that you want to implement on your fields. So down at the bottom, you can see they have, you can pick what type of operation you are. So right now I have crop management selected in this screenshot because that's what we tend to work with the most in Maryland. And then cover cropping, because that's, one of our big programs. And you can see there's a couple different options for, how those cover crops are managed. So you would pick whichever one is the most appropriate. And then specify how many acres you have. So if you go to the next slide, Amanda, this will kind of show you what the results look like. So you can see here, we're thinking about a farm where you have 100 acres of no-till and cover crops. And you can see kind of the yearly sequestration potential for those practices. And like I said, this is it just looks up on a table what the values are. So depending on what location you specify, it'll say, oh, on average in Baltimore County, a cover crop will sequester this much carbon, and then kind of multiply that by the acres and give you a total result. So this is good to use if you want to have a general idea of the impact of practices on a landscape. But it doesn't actually do any modeling that's like location specific to your farm. And that's why it's so simple to use. You can kind of in a handful of minutes go in and figure out how much a whole operation has the potential to sequester if you want to adopt specific practices. And then I guess it's also worth pointing out for some of the gases, there's no estimates calculated, and they give a justification for that in like a short technical document that they have for the comment tools. But just so you know what that any means, that if that ever shows up, that's what it means. There's no estimate calculated. You can go to the next slide, Amanda. So Comet Farm is the other kind of it's the older brother to the Comet Planner tool. It's more complicated. It takes a lot more time to use, but it's more complicated for a good reason. So Comet Farm is the tool that actually does modeling based on your specific location. It pulls in information from web soil survey online to actually map out what soils are on your farm and kind of see what the different sequestration potential of those soils are. You have to put in a lot more information about what your crop rotation is, what types of cover crops you want to grow if you're growing cover crops, and it needs a few years worth of information to kind of do the modeling. So it's not just oh, I'm growing corn this year and I'm going to grow a cover crop. It's, I grew, beans one year, corn the next, and then wheat the year after that, and it really kind of provides a more specific value based on your particular practices and location. And like I said, it is much more time intensive. I think I was listening to someone give a talk about both of these tools, and they said Comet Planner, which is the more simplistic version, took them about 4 minutes to run for the farm, and Comet Farm took them, a day and a half to run. And in that case, they got pretty similar values from each one, but I think that it really depends on who you are and what your farm is, where your farm is, and what practices you're using. Because if you're in a pocket of the county that has a unusual soil type, or kind of slightly different conditions, you might get a pretty different answer. So Comet Farm is something that you would use if you really need to verify carbon sequestration. So you'll see some of the carbon markets using Comet Farm as part of their data collection and validation methods. You can go to the next slide. So the next tool that I'm going to talk about, this is much simpler. There's no web interface for this one. You don't have to have a lot of farm history. This is really kind of like a site visit tool that you would use. It's called the Maryland Soil Health Card. And there should be a link posted in the chat as well. There's also one at the bottom of the slide if these slides get made available. And what the soil health card is it's really a physical assessment of the soil. So when you go and do a site visit with someone, you can bring a handful of really simple tools with you and kind of walk through each of these indicators and give them a score between 0 and 11, and then add up the total score and kind of get a general picture of the health of that soil at that point that you did the health card. You can go to the next slide, Amanda. And so here's a list of all the tools you need. So most of this is stuff that people just kind of have around on their farms or in your office even. The only thing on here that's more of a barrier is the Munsell color book. Those can be kind of expensive if you want to buy a copy. But if you work with the extension office or NRCS or any number of other partners, they'll likely have one. So I would check before if you invest in something like that, because it could be a couple $100 to get a Munsell color book. But you can also find PDFs online. They're not going to be as accurate because the color of the color chips, it can change when it's displayed on a screen and that sort of thing. But you can use something like that, as a replacement if necessary. You can go to the next slide, Amanda. So I kind of wanted to tie some of these indicators that we're measuring to some of the ecosystem services that we talked about earlier. So ecosystem services like decreased runoff, we're measuring surface cover, infiltration rates, organic matter, and soil structure, and all those kind of directly relate to how much runoff is coming off of your fields. Things like improving surface cover and having less compaction and more root growth that can increase your nutrient uptake in kind of fallow periods and stop leaching from happening. And then there are a lot of other broad soil health benefits that come from biological activity and nutrient cycling. You're getting more efficient use out of the inputs that you're putting on the farm and kind of banking them for later is a good way to think about it. You can go on to the next one. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the results from some of the soil health card testing that we've done. So at MDA, we've worked with NRCS to use the soil health card at probably, I think it's been more than 100 sites across the state at this point. The results that I have up here are just specific to the Eastern Shore, because it's kind of hard to compare across the state because soils are so different. So you kind of want to group things together for comparison based on what kind of soils they have. And you can see even on this graph within the Eastern Shore, we've kind of had to split the results based on medium or coarse soil texture. And then you can see some of these things are kind of season to season, like surface cover and odor or earthworm counts. And some of these things are, longer term, like structure and organic matter accumulation and compaction. And we kind of see what we expect, where, the annual results have a high score because they can be influenced more quickly. And then, compaction and structure have a lower score because they take a lot longer to develop. And because we've been using the health card on so many different sites, we've kind of put together some revisions that kind of look at structure across a gradient, because a lot of times we're seeing in places where people have converted from tillage to no-till, we're starting to see a difference around 3 inches in the soil where the structure is really different and, above where the plow pan used to be. And so some of their scores are artificially low. We're seeing an improvement, but because it's not consistent across that, 6-inch sample that we're digging, they tend to get a lower score. So we're thinking about things like that as we're going through and using the health card. And you can go to the next slide, Amanda. And this is the last thing that I have to talk about, I believe. It's the Cornell Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health. That's what the CASH stands for. So this is a really broad suite of soil health testing that gets sent to a lab. And this is the only thing that I'm going to talk about that has kind of a fee associated with it. You have to send it off and pay somebody else to do an analysis for you. But in Maryland, we're using 2 different tests to kind of complement that physical part with the soil health card that I've talked about, and then also the nutrient testing. So we're looking at active carbon and soil respiration. So active carbon is kind of like the carbon in the soil that's available to be used up by, microorganisms or other things that need to use carbon. And respiration is a measure of the current biological activity in the soil. So you can think of active carbon as kind of one of those early leading indicators for respiration, kind of similar to the health card. And again, you can see, we're kind of seeing what we would expect, where the active carbon scores improve sooner, and then the respiration score kind of lags behind as those communities get established and start to take more advantage of the carbon that's available in the soil. You can move on to the next slide. I think that's time for questions if people have any. I know that was a lot, but like I said, hoping just to introduce these tools to people so that they know they exist and can maybe think about how to use them or if they should use them when they're working with producers.
Perfect. Thanks, Kevin. Your timing is perfect. We're at about 11:17 and we have time for questions. And Kevin, if you wouldn't mind checking that Whova Q&A box, that would be helpful.
Sure.
Have good access to it. And in the meantime, why don't we bring that question back up that we tabled earlier? I'll just read it again for the panelists. Do the panelists think that our conservation community will eventually be able to rely on integrators, seed fertilizer companies, and future food markets to accelerate soil health practices? If not, what can practitioners do to get their attention? And if we want more clarification on that question, we can ask the person that asked it to take themselves off mute or raise their hand. But Lisa, do you want to share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in, but I'd welcome thoughts also from Mary and Amanda and Kevin. I kind of like this conversational element that we've got with the Q&A part of it. But so we are starting to see the beginnings of some of the integrators kind of encouraging their farmers to adopt some of these practices or just conservation practices in general. There's a great example that's presented at the Chesapeake Forum in past years with Turkey Hill working with the Maryland and Virginia Co-op for the dairy farms to make sure that those farms have implemented conservation practices on their farms, and they'll get a premium then on their milk prices. And I'm also starting to see a little bit of conversation happening beyond just integrators, but even with financial institutions, as farms are going to their banks and their lenders for additional credit and to borrow some money. There's starting to be a little bit more of a conversation happening around those conservation practices that are in that farm, and trying to get a feel for that long-term economic viability of the farm that's happening in those financial discussions as well. The seed and fertilizer companies, I could go two different directions with this answer, right? I mean, we have definitely seen the seed companies as interest in cover crops have increased over the last decade or so. We've definitely seen the seed companies' response to that growing demand for cover crop seeds. I'd say almost all the major companies now have those cover crop seeds available. Some of them will do custom mixes as well. So I think we're already seeing that supply being met from the seed companies. The fertilizer side of the conversation is a little bit different, right? Because the message that we're preaching is, as we're building these soils and regenerating and building that organic pool of nutrients, the farmers should be allowed to start cutting back and be able to cut back on their fertilizer inputs. So that is kind of in conflict of the fertilizer side of ag industry, right? Because for their long-term business plan, they want to be selling more product and more product. So it's a little bit of a conflicting interest with the fertilizer folks having these conservation messages around soil health with their clients and with their farmers, because it may not necessarily be in their best interest. And then I already kind of touched on the food market side of it. And wouldn't it be a great incentive for folks to adopt some of these practices if they can get paid for the quality of their food that they're growing? But I'd welcome some thoughts from the rest of the panelists too on those topics.
I can jump in someone, kind of on the food markets question too, is I think it's an interesting moment, at least that I'm seeing with COVID as well. And this kind of growing awareness of where food's from and what that means and the practices. But I think that there's still a lot of room for education because, and as we've talked about here, there's a lot of terms thrown around. You hear regenerative agriculture. What does that mean? What does that mean a farmer's doing? And I think that's where you're seeing some larger companies getting into that space too. But, understanding what that means to them and how to build that communication. So, kind of what we've been thinking about for the soil initiative, which is really that outreach and education side, is how to kind of do that push-pull of, where the demand exists, but also anticipating where demand will come and putting education kind of in between there.
Really good to hear, Lisa and Mary. Thanks for those comments. Amanda and Kevin, do you have anything you want to add? I would like to open it up to our attendees. There may be somebody participating in the session that might have some thoughts on this. So if you do, attendees should be able to take themselves off mute. And again, I would encourage, some thinking around this. Since we have time, we have about 8 minutes left in our discussion. I want to give we have a couple more slides we want to share, but any thoughts on this? I'm thinking maybe anybody from the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay in the room, in addition to Nisa, who's our tech host, but Jenna.
A couple of thoughts.
Okay, Kevin.
I mean, I think for us in Maryland, we're kind of thinking about pulling on this network of kind of trusted advisors to farmers, to have it be an avenue to get some of the conversation around soil health be more integrated into their day-to-day thinking. One of the challenges that we deal with in Maryland and at MDA specifically, because we're a state agency and we have, some regulatory responsibilities around nutrient management and water quality specifically. When we approach a farmer with, an idea to implement some practices on their fields, and maybe take some soil tests and kind of work with them a little more closely, there can be a hesitancy sometimes because of our regulatory authority, where they don't want necessarily to share as much data with us, or are concerned that we're going to find something that's against our code and come back with a fine or something like that, which is not our intention, obviously. So I think working with outside organizations that farmers work with more frequently, and kind of getting a consistent message about soil health could be a really great path forward. And I would also say, kind of thinking some about the fertilizer company side of things. This is only one, fertilizer company, but I was at a field day where there's a company in Maryland called Willard's that was there presenting, and the person who was giving the talk was, really talking about how he doesn't think about them as a fertilizer company anymore. He thinks about them as like a plant nutrition company. So I think there's kind of a slightly changing framework that could lend itself more to being amenable to soil health practices and topics. Not meaning to say that that's kind of broad and going on all over the place, but I think maybe it's the start of it, and maybe we could encourage others to adopt similar mindsets.
Thank you, Kevin. That was really great, great perspective as well. Why don't we move on to Mary has a slide to share here, the power of partnerships. So Mary, you want to kind of wrap up here, and then we have, well, then we'll close out our session, but let's hear what you have to say.
And I can keep this really brief in case there's another quick question or something, but I think having Amanda, Lisa, Kevin, and myself here today, we all run partnership-based approaches to building soil health. And as we've kind of explored today, and we're just getting into, is there's a lot more stakeholders getting into the space of soil health, and how do we use that collective power to move efforts forward, but also find common ground. And so put a slide up, so don't mind my dogs in the background, about, how do we move towards that, and that it is kind of playing that long game. And you'll see here, and this is collective impact as one model, but I just like this graphic mainly on how, you move from a lot of efforts happening around soil health, around watershed conservation, to slowly kind of coordinate and build that together. And that communication is key in that, education, and finding all of those overlaps. But really, I'd welcome anything from Amanda, Lisa, or Kevin on this too. I just wanted to introduce the topic.
Yeah, I know in Pennsylvania, we've had a little bit more of that scattered approach historically. We've got groups that work with different sectors of agriculture in Pennsylvania, and each independently doing their conservation messaging and their soil health messaging. And we've really seen the benefit of forming our Pennsylvania Soil Health Coalition to just have that venue to bring us all to the table, 4 or 5 times a year, have that conversation, be able to share what we're all doing, create kind of that common vision and common messaging on where we want to take this moving forward in Pennsylvania. So for sure, I agree with the title of this slide. There's definitely power in partnerships, and getting that messaging out there.
And I would just add, as I work as a field liaison with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and certainly the Chesapeake Bay Stewardship Fund is very eager to bring in and encourage projects that are working to build partnerships and conservation collaboratives. And certainly there have been some really great examples of that in recent years around soil health. So that's exciting. Why don't we move to the slide?
Yeah, and if there's time for questions too, I have kind of a follow-up thought that I could add.
Okay, go ahead, Lisa. Why don't you go ahead with that, and then we'll go ahead.
We'll end with this action item for the soil of how folks can take action themselves. I just had kind of a follow-up thought to Emily's question earlier about, what potentially could motivate farmers that aren't doing these practices now and are maybe on the fence about it. And I think perhaps seeing these changing climate patterns that we've seen these past 5-10 years, that may be a real motivating factor for farms to start implementing these practices. And I think if you were to ask any grower out there if they'd be interested in increasing soil organic matter on their farm, 99 out of 100, I'm sure, would say, oh yeah, I would love to increase soil organic matter on my farm. So that's an opportunity to start that conversation about what practices it takes to build that organic matter, because we're seeing with these real dry years, droughty years that we've had, or in Pennsylvania, we've had a very, very wet year, especially a very wet fall. And these farms that have really built up these resilient soils, they really weather those weather extremes much more easily than traditionally managed farms, you know, where their soils aren't as healthy and as functioning. So it may not be any messaging, you know, that organizations do, or regulations that are coming down the pipe, or markets. It may just be these unpredictable weather extremes that we've been seeing on a more frequent basis that may motivate some farms to make some of these changes.
All right, thanks, Lisa, for that final word from our presenters. Thanks so much, presenters, for developing a really excellent workshop. Really appreciate it. And Nisa popped a question in there, a thinking question for the attendees to consider going forward. How can your work benefit from examining soil health and water quality in tandem? So there's a lot to do out there. We really appreciate you participating in today's workshop. Again, thanks so much for this excellent presentation and workshop. Attendees, please take a moment to review and fill out a session evaluation by clicking Rate Session on your individual session page in Whova. Thanks again, Nisa. Thank you for being our tech host behind the scenes and for working out this, for participating in this workshop. I'm going to close out the session. Again, thanks all. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.